Turning to football, of course, Jed, the recruiting situation kind of in a lull across the nation. Not a whole lot happening. Much is simmering. There are a lot of camps, the Under Armour camps and so forth going on over the last month to 6 weeks. Your thoughts about the Georgia 2026 class as it's rounding into form, and who are the big targets that are being talked about right now?
Yeah, they've only got, I think, 4 commits. 3, let me think, 3 on the offensive side of the ball, or 2 on the offensive side of the ball and 2 on the defense. So a couple defensive backs committed, which you expect with Kirby Smart. But yeah, I think the big one is Jared Curtis, a quarterback. He was a former Georgia commit for about 6 months, maybe, and he decommitted because he wanted to take other visits and didn't want to do it while he was committed, which is fair. But I think Georgia is still trending in a positive direction there. And then I think a big question for me is, how do you follow up a really good receiver class in 2025, which they've already got a top 100 guy committed in Vance Spafford from California? And can you land some studs on the offensive line? Because the offensive line classes the past couple of years have been good. I don't think they maybe were at the level of the 2017, 2018 classes. So do you really hit one of those home run classes along the offensive line? There's a lot of targets out there. They're in with Jackson Cantwell, who is the, I believe, #1 prospect for us on Rivals, and some other 5-star top 100 type guys. But being in it's great. Getting visits is great. You got to close on some of these guys. I think that's what's going to be interesting to see as spring visits shake out. Who do they really have a chance at? Who are we going to be looking at the end of April and say, these are the guys Georgia's actually got a shot to land?
And the thought is that ever since Kirby Smart got established there after about year 2, is that they've got a shot at anyone, that they pretty much have their selection process down and can get anyone. And of course, Georgia is probably the highest surging state in regards to talent on the
Mm-hmm.
upper end, where it used to be Texas, Florida, California third. Georgia's pretty much knocked California out of the way and become the third most prominent state. So it's, I'm sure, a strong recruiting class in state again, and you're not going to win all those battles. But anyone in particular to highlight, whether that in state or out of state, that is at the top of the wish list?
Yeah. You think, I mean, again, Cantwell is one. You look at, I mean, running back there after Derek Cooper out of, I think he's from Miami, who was committed for like 3 days last summer. And then it was a whole, his mom went on Twitter and said he's not committed. It was a whole thing. But I think Georgia is in a good spot with him as well. He'll be back in Athens probably this spring, and then he's got an official visit set up. So those guys, I think receiver is one that's kind of a question mark. A bunch of offers went out this spring. I think it's going to be interesting. Or an area on defense they really need to look at is outside linebacker, edge, whatever, because they haven't really had those game record guys anyway. Like Jalen Walker was one. Michael Williams was kind of there, but never really was a consistent game record, I guess. And then they had a bunch of guys transfer out. So they really need to rebuild that room. And there's a couple guys in state. Kamari Brooks is one. There's some guys out of state. I think of Rodney Dunham from North Carolina they really like. Xavion Griffin-Haynes is one. They've sent some new offers out. So I think that position on defense is who can they get that will fit in Georgia's defense, can do all the stuff they ask those guys to do, set the edge against the run, whatever. But you got to get some guys that get sacks or at least affect the passer at the end of the day. And I think that's an area of focus on defense in this class for sure.
Jed, as soon as you said game wrecker, I thought of the Super Bowl, because
Exactly.
I don't know if that was unprecedented in regards to, there are pictures all over social media and video of 3 Georgia
Mhm.
linemen all lined up, and then obviously 4 starters on defense total. And I don't know if that's unprecedented, taking from one college football team to a Super Bowl championship offense or defense. But just to imagine, only 3 years ago, these guys were winning a national championship in college, and only 2 years ago, they were winning a national championship, another one in college, of course. And then you just take 2 years later and supplant them onto an NFL defense, and they're winning a Super Bowl championship only 2 years later. Is like guys in their mid 20s. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and you look at those championship teams, those defenses, like the defensive lines Georgia's had the past couple of years have been good, but I don't think you've had those like just dominant, consistent. Like Jalen Carter in 2022 was like just unstoppable, unblockable. Jalen Walker flashed that. Michael Williams occasionally flashed that. He battled injuries a lot. I don't know that they really had that guy that's just, you need him to go make like you think of the clip in the Super Bowl where a few years ago where what's his name? Sean McVay. He says Aaron Donald's going to go make a play, and Aaron Donald, pressures Joe Burrow and sacks him or throws incomplete or whatever, and they win the Super Bowl. I don't think Georgia's got that guy in the past few years where you can say, "Hey, this guy's going to go get a sack on this play." And I think some of that is scheme. They don't necessarily prioritize pass rushing first. You see a guy like Trayvon Walker whose sack numbers didn't blow you away in college, and he's having success in the NFL. Michael Williams could do the same thing. So, Nolan Smith wasn't a guy who had a ton of sacks in college, but he tested off the charts at the combine and has had a great playoff run with the Eagles. So I think when you look at defensive linemen, I think they signed some of those guys in the 25 class. You look at Elijah Griffin, who was a 5-star as an example, but I think this class is more about the defensive linemen too, but the outside linebackers like the Nolan Smiths, right? Like the Jalen Walkers who can really get after the quarterback in a variety of ways.
Jed, when you made the comment about Sean McVay making that statement to Aaron Donald, not necessarily was the Notre Dame player who came off the edge in that category by any stretch, but he was the guy in the moment, obviously, and at the first half, in what might have been the play that ended Georgia's season, even though the game wasn't anywhere close to being over, that obviously just turned the scales in Notre Dame's favor. So you were talking about offensive line play and it not being as tightened up in the last few years as it's been. Was that more recruiting? Like if we looked at the recruiting rankings, or is it more development?
I think it's some of both. I think, and I've only covered recruiting for a few years, so I think I'm be the best person to answer it. But like, I feel like there haven't been as many guys who have come out of high school and been like, this guy is a day one starter. Like Andrew Thomas, when he came out of high school, he started day one at Georgia, pretty much. Guy like Broderick Jones, you thought could be a day one starter. And I don't know, one, that there have been that many guys like that, but two, NIL can spread all these guys out. Instead of one team landing 2 or 3 5-stars, they're diluting the talent out, which is good, I think, overall for college football. But when you're a team like Georgia, then it's like, okay, we got to get some of these guys, and then you got to develop. And Monroe, there's the 22 and 23 classes didn't pan out that great because you had some guys leave. You had a guy, Kelton Smith, who medically retired, and Ernest Green has been a hit from 22, but he struggled this past year due to injuries. Monroe Freeling has been a guy from 2023 who has mostly played well, and then that Sugar Bowl was just an abomination when he had to play left tackle. So, and I think this year you look at it, spinning it to the team side a little bit, you lose Tate Ratledge, you lose Dylan Fairchild, you're going to be on your third different center in 3 years. You lose Xavier Truss, who has been there for a decade, it feels like. So it's the time for those classes to really step up. And there's some guys who've got talent, but don't necessarily have a lot of experience. So I think spring practice is going to be very interesting because I truly think all 5 spots probably are wide open.
When we look at the 2025 class, I know I'm taking us around the recruiting rounds here. Who would you expect could make a splash early?
I think Elijah Griffin, who I mentioned earlier, could be one because he's just such an impressive physical kid. And I think, I talked to him a few times about the recruiting process, and mentally, I think he has what it takes to handle a transition to college. And like I said, you need studs up front. And I think he is one. And I think offensively, you look at, they signed 2 top 40, 50 receivers in CJ Wiley and Talon Taylor, who I think are both really good. CJ Wiley is a big body, probably 6'4", 210 pounds, which they haven't really had a lot of, or didn't really have a lot of in the receiver room last year. And then Talon Taylor's just really good at everything. Like, he's not He's not a sub 4.4 guy. He's not 6'5". He's just so well polished and a great route runner that I think it's going to be hard to keep him off the field. So I think those two guys on offense. Defensively, you look at Griffin. Maybe Isaiah Gibson because he's one of those edge defensive end outside linebacker types that I think could work his way into a role depending on how things go, how he adjusts to college. But yeah, I mean that's the one thing about recruiting, Will, is it's hard to play as a freshman when you've got so many talented guys in front of you. But also with the transfer portal and depth pieces transferring out, that also opens up the door for some of those guys. So spring practice is huge, and I want to say all but a handful of the freshmen early enrolled, which is huge, obviously, for the chances of playing this fall.
Jed, how does the situation with Carson Beck go south so quickly? And maybe I'm making too much of it. Maybe he just made some kind of business decision, but we're talking about a guy who came within an eyelash of taking a team into the playoff that would have been, of course, the prohibitive favorite. He comes into the season as ranked the number one. Check out any site preseason 2024. It's Carson Beck's the best quarterback in college football, number one team, all of that. His statistics show that he didn't have nearly the season this past year, although there were other factors. They led the league or led the nation in drop passes and so forth. But I got to say, that was the transfer portal entry that blindsided me. I didn't know that there was any kind of issue or that he was looking to move on. And all of a sudden, of course, he gets injured right at the end of the first half of the SEC championship game. But, how do you read that entire situation and the way that played out?
Yeah, I mean, all year it just something felt off. Like just the offense never really clicked for any extended period of time. Like, okay, the second half against Clemson was great. All right, dynamite. And then, the Kentucky game wasn't good. And then the Alabama game, like, they put a bunch of points in the second half, but they had to throw the ball every play and you had 4 down. So it's hard to take anything from that. It just never really felt in sync. And with Carson specifically, you saw some plays where he made really bad decisions. I don't know if that's pressing or trusting his arm talent. Like I think of the Florida game where he had a couple, I think, back-to-back drives in the first half where he's just throwing it and you're like, what is he doing? That's a guy who's started for a season and a half at that point. He's taken a ton of practice reps. You can't do that at that level of experience. So, and then he gets hurt and then he kind of just goes off the radar for a while, and then he's not with the team when they go to the Sugar Bowl, and he eventually shows up, but it's like, you'd think he'd be there helping Gunnar Stockton get ready, and it's not like he was, right by his side. So it was a weird thing, and I think by the end of the year, it was pretty clear that he was going to be gone. Obviously, everybody thought it was going to be the NFL, and then, the transfer portal thing, I just think it was one of those things where it was time for both sides maybe to move on. And he ended up in Miami. Everybody knows his girlfriend's at Miami, and Miami's got all the NIL money and whatever. But I don't think the end of the year necessarily was, I don't want to say they didn't end on good terms, but it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, I think, at the end of the year, for one reason or another. And then I think it was pretty clear that, both sides could benefit from a fresh start.
And certainly, considering the circumstances Gunnar Stockton was thrown into, I don't think anyone thinks that he did a horrible job by any stretch. He made a bad pick very early from the time he jumped into the game against Texas, but obviously they recovered. They won the game. And did he play well against Notre Dame? I wouldn't say he played great. I wouldn't say he played awful. It wasn't his issue. He was, far down the list of issues for Georgia against Notre Dame. But he's obviously not a slam dunk. We know this guy's going to be a superstar. You wouldn't think, okay, this is the situation in Georgia. So is there a quarterback battle? And are you surprised that they haven't done more in acquiring anyone?
Yeah, I think there's very much a battle. I think Ryan Puglisi is a redshirt freshman who has all the talent in the world. He got here last January and missed spring practice last year because he had a knee, I think a stress fracture in his knee. But obviously you're soaking up the playbook and all that kind of stuff. And everything we heard from practice last year, like this kid is the truth, arm talent. He played baseball in high school, so he's got mobility. So yeah, I think there's absolutely a world where he's the starter game one this fall. I think it's going to be an open competition. But when you look at Kirby Smart's track record, I think he also favors the guy who has the most, is the oldest. And, Gunnar Stockton's been in Georgia in the program at Georgia for 3 years plus now. And him and Mike Bobo have a long relationship. He committed to Bobo when he was at South Carolina. So they go way back. So I don't know. I still think Gunnar Stockton's the favorite right now. But yeah, I think Ryan Puglisi has a chance. It's going to come down to spring practice. I think it's going to be wide open for sure. I don't think, 2 years ago you saw it was Beck and Vandegrift and a freshman Stockton. And I was like, okay, it's a competition, but this is going to be Carson Beck's unless he really screws this up. I think it's going to be much more of an open competition, maybe than it was even 2 years ago.
All right, Jed May stopping by. Track Jed's work right there on his X handle, Jed May, but also UGAsports.com is the place to find him. Rivals coverage of Georgia athletics. Jed, we always appreciate you stopping by. Good to see you, and you have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Absolutely, man. Anytime.